Welcome to the Analog Gamers Podcast, a short podcast on board games and board gaming experiences. Here are your hosts.
I'm Shane.
And I'm Brent.
And I'm Frank.
Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of the Analog Gamers Podcast. Today we're going to talk about card mechanics, and that really includes games that are entirely cards, games that use cards as a part of a board structure, and we'll talk about all kinds of different ways that you can use cards beyond kind of the classic breaking out a deck of cards, shuffling them, and playing war. So some great reasons that cards are included in board games include hidden information. So most of the time you'll have a hand of cards and all the other players at the table can't see what they are. Sometimes this works to your advantage, and sometimes if you're playing with teammates or partners, this can kind of increase the difficulty of the game for you. Another great reason is to increase the rate of randomness. So when you shuffle, 52 card deck as in a traditional deck, you're going to get as close to random as possible.
Depending on whether it's with replacement or without replacement.
Yeah, and depending on how well you can shuffle, I guess.
Yeah, that is very true.
Thing. So I think a great place to start is, guys, what are some of your favorite games that include cards?
So my least favorite is poker. My favorite, I don't think I could. I don't know that I have one because I don't. So it wouldn't be a card game, card specific game,
right?
Because those tend to. I like them. I tend to like games that incorporate cards, but then I don't think of. I think of which games I like the most. I don't think of which games that have cards do I like the most. So I don't know that I could come up with that very quickly. Brent?
So if I'm looking at games that have cards, I would go with the deck builder. Which one? That I don't have a favorite, but the mechanism I like best is probably deck building.
Can you explain that mechanism?
So with deck building, generally everyone starts with a similar or the same hand of base cards, and there's a market of some sort, where there's multiple different card types, each of which do different things. And throughout the game, you buy cards off the market or you acquire cards off of a common deck, and then your deck continues to recycle as you discard and reshuffle up.
And grow.
And then you play off combos and play off all the cards that are in your deck as they come out in your hand at that point.
Yeah, I love deck building games too. So a good example of this would be Dominion, probably the most popular deck building game out there.
Kind of the granddaddy of them all.
The granddaddy, just like you, Frank. Granddaddy.
Wow, thank you. I do not have grandchildren, so we're not impugning my son on anything here.
That's true. Anyway, so the game of Dominion, you can the game provides pre-selected cards that you can play with. You can also randomize what cards you want to play with in the market. You start with some coppers in your deck and some victory points, shuffle it up, and essentially one of the reasons I love deck building games is as you build your deck, kind of those cards that were really good in the start of the game kind of start becoming just trash in your deck in the later part of the game.
Sometimes.
And oftentimes. So if you think about Dominion, right, a copper, which is worth 1 treasure, 1 monies, as I say, is definitely not worth as much as a gold, which is worth 3. So when you're near the end of the game and you're trying to buy really expensive cards and you draw a hand and you've got like 5 copper and every card you want costs 8 or more, that can be really frustrating to do.
So interestingly enough, one of the mechanisms that generally happens in a deck builder is a trash mechanic. So you're able to trash cards out of your hand. My wife Lindsay, over the Christmas season, I bought her Hogwarts Battles, and it's a deck builder. It never has a trash card in it in the base game. So you start the game, the whole entire game, no matter how complicated you get, with the same deck of hands based on your character, and you can never get rid of them. So you have to work around that.
Interesting.
It makes the second one that happens a lot is drawing a lot of cards. It makes that a lot more important.
Yeah.
So you can at least get those cards out and get other cards in. So.
Yeah, I think the ability to trash really increases the strategy in deck building games because you start trashing cards that are either bad or even mediocre just to increase your probability of drawing better cards. And sometimes it's a balance. So like playing Dominion, there are cards that are specifically victory cards, which count at the end of the game, but while you're playing, do absolutely nothing. So you want them in your deck, but you don't necessarily want them in your hand.
So let's back up a little bit, because I think it would help for anybody who's not familiar with these kind of games. Typically, you have as you grow your deck, regardless of how big your deck is, what you're going to do is every turn you're going to start with a hand of 5 cards, and that's where the limitation is. Because you have a hand of 5 cards, as the game goes on, the weak cards in your deck showing up in your hand is a problem. Sometimes in these games, you can, as we talked about, trash them out, which means remove them from your deck and they go permanently out of the game. Or sometimes there's also, I'm thinking of Star Realms, which has a lot of cards which allow you, well, Dominion does this too. They allow you to draw more cards so that you can get bigger than a hand of 5 as you're playing, or effectively get a bigger than a hand of 5. So, and both of those are really important to have because, as Shane pointed out, sometimes you're looking to buy something that's more expensive than you could ever buy with the beginning cards, with the starter cards of everybody's starting deck. But if you can somehow either increase the size of your hand or get rid of the lesser cards as the game goes on, now you got a shot at it. So for those of you who have not played a deck builder, that's kind of at the center of what we're talking about.
And I think another great thing about deck building games is typically there's a lot of different strategies you can take. So a lot of the cards will have synergy with each other. So in Dominion, you might have a card that lets you draw 2 more cards, which is great, but in Dominion, you can only play 1 action per turn. So if you draw 2 cards, but they're both action cards, you're kind of stuck, and that didn't really help you at all. But a card that lets you draw 1 and take an extra action, that synergy works really well if you have a ton of action cards. So typically there's a lot of different strategies in these games to allow you to kind of take different approaches as you play. And because a game like Dominion has so many expansions, I don't think I've ever played a game of Dominion that's been the same as a previous game. They're always so different because there's always different strategy, always different cards out there on the board.
So Dominion, for example, I think you put 10 cards out, 10 types of cards out in the market.
Correct.
But the box comes with 25 types of cards,
Something
so
like
that you can really mix and match and do stuff. Brent, you were going to say something.
And not only is every game different, every person's game almost has to be different based on what they built their cards to be like.
Yes.
That the same 2 people playing the exact same game won't necessarily be playing the same game in deck builders.
Right. I think another one of my favorite deck building games, I don't know if you guys have played, is Legendary.
I have not.
So Legendary is a deck building game that takes place within the Marvel universe. So essentially you're recruiting the Marvel heroes to be in your deck. You start with like shield agents, and the shield agents are how you go out and you recruit these superheroes to be a part of your team, which essentially is your deck. And I really enjoy that because it's really flavorful, and I think Marvel is at least these days, pretty accessible. Everybody knows the superheroes. You know, there's some of the kind of more secondary. Okay, if you're a comic nerd, I apologize. More secondary in kind of the movie Marvel universe, Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yeah. But yeah, so Legendary, I think is a really cool game that really kind of lets you play some of those favorite characters that you have. And the synergy in Marvel comes, each hero kind of has a different type to them. So, right, Spider-Man definitely isn't one of the like buff, mighty superheroes in the game. He kind of does more strategic things, whereas the Hulk pretty much just has power, and he just, as you might imagine, smashes things.
We have a Hulk.
Hulk smash. So what are some other, so we talked about deck building, what are some other card mechanics that you guys enjoy in games?
One of the ones that tends to be the central point of a game is trick taking. And for a long time, one of my favorite card games we called it Oh Hell. It's also known as Up the River, Down the River, but basically it's a trick taking game where when you bid, you're trying to get the exact number that you bid. Not more, not less. You want to get that exact number. And you get, the way we played, you get points for being wrong. So at the end of the game, you want the lowest points. And every round, if everybody bid perfectly, maybe nobody takes points. But if the number of bids didn't end up to the number of cards in hand, if they were lower or more, that meant somebody was going to get points. And I really enjoyed that. Other trick-taking games, I can't, like I've played Euchre several times. I cannot get my arms around or my head wrapped around that game. I think we talked about that in an episode last season. But I do like trick taking as a mechanism.
So trick taking.
That's
how,
one
how are we defining that? So obviously in classic games, it's a one up kind of thing. People put down cards, and if you have a higher card or a trump or that kind of thing, you're going to take the cards, right?
Right.
In Broom Service, because Lindsay and I played it, it's not a higher card. You have to play the same card roll that someone else did, but the last person to play that card roll and declare that they're risking it is going to be the person that takes that. Would that also be considered a trick taking?
Maybe.
And so that's why I bring this up, is because I'm not sure if that how broad this definition gets on trick taking.
So it's kind of strange because there are. So I see your point. There's another set of games called ladder building games, and they're not in our outline for this episode, but I'm tossing them in anyway. Where you can play multiple. The idea is that you're kind of playing within suits like trick taking, but you can play multiple cards, and the sum total of all the cards in your play area that you have out in play for that suit has to exceed anybody else's. So it keeps going, ratcheting up the points that are on the board. And if you can't, you're out. Okay. And then finally somebody's going to take that trick. There are a lot of people who kind of fold ladder building games. Some people say, oh, that's a different game. But there are some people who say, oh, no, that's still a style of trick taking. So to answer your question, I'm not. It kind of sounds like trick taking because you're playing cards to win the cards on the table, and that kind of to me is the kernel of trick taking.
So, and I bring this up also because it uses it differently than most trick taking games, where it's about the cards. These are rolls. At the beginning of the round, you select 5 rolls, and then the leader puts
Rolls.
The cards are used as rolls in the game. So, for example, one of them is a witch that you deliver a potion. One of them's a druid that you collect.
Okay.
Sorry.
Gotcha.
And so the leader puts down 1 and says whether they want to be risky or safe. If they're safe, they get to use it. If they're risky, it moves to the next player. If they have that same roll in their hand and they play it down and also want to go risky, then the first player doesn't get to do anything.
So no, I would not call that the way you're describing it. And now that you mention it, I've heard other people describe this game, and it's starting to ring a bell, even though I've never played it. That description does not sound like trick taking. That sounds like, actually, that doesn't sound like anything I've ever seen before.
For me, it comes down to if you say, that's my trick, and then you take it, then I would say, yes, it's trick taking.
Wow.
I know.
That's almost as good as rolling the dice off the table.
So, trick taking, it's a familiar mechanic, at least in our part of the country, right? Because euchre is such a familiar game culturally for us. But it sounds like there's not a lot of popular kind of modern board games out there that use this mechanic.
So, that's not true. There are a number of them. They don't tend to ever float to the top of BGG. But if you look up trick taking out there to look at modern games, there's a lot. There's, what's the one you and I play? Triumvirate, which is a trick taking game specifically designed for 2 people to play. So it's got some other stuff going on. You are taking tricks, but you're not the objective is kind of come up to it sideways. And then there's Bottle Imp, which is really designed for 3 players and sounds really interesting to me. I can't remember the description. I just remember it sounded interesting because it had it's a slightly different take on trick taking. Haggis is one. There's quite a few. They just never get to be really, really popular games. I think because the theme is so old. You know, that mechanic is so old that they're cool, but they never make the top.
Right. And we obviously don't make them to the top of our list very often.
No, they don't.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever played a game other than with, a 52 deck of cards that uses trick taking.
Right. And none of these are traditional games in terms of equipment either. They're not using Bottle Imp. None of those use a traditional deck of cards. They use a specialized deck of cards.
So one of my favorite mechanics with cards is set collection. So in set collection, I'm trying to think of how to define this without saying you collect sets. So in set collection,
give an example.
So such as we've talked about before, Sushi Go is a set collection game. So as you're picking cards, you're seeking to get several of the same type of cards. So in Sushi Go, there's tempura, there's other types that are eluding me at the moment.
So let's go down to Go Fish.
Go Fish.
Go Fish would be a set
Go
collector.
Fish would be a set collection card. Rummy would be a set collection.
And I think everyone's played Go Fish, so they can understand.
Rummy would be one. Canasta would be a set collection game.
Oh, shout out to my mom, Canasta. Heck yeah. So those are all set collection games, similar to Sushi Go, where you're collecting sets of sushi. So another one of my all-time favorites, and I think we've talked about Sushi Go, is also Seven Wonders, where you're collecting sets of cards to gain victory points. So more specifically, the science cards in Seven Wonders, they match up a certain way. So there's 3 symbols, all of the same symbol you square. So if you got 3 cogs, 3 squared is 9. But then there's also, if you get 1 of each symbol, that's worth 7 points together. So in Seven Wonders, there's a component of set collection. Another set collection game that I really enjoy, and Frank, you're a little more familiar with, so you can talk about this a little bit, is Scripts and Scribes. Can you tell about that game a little bit?
So Scripts and Scribes is a game where I actually talked about this a little bit in the last episode, because you have dice in this too that are not rolled. They're used to increase or decrease the value of certain suits. But you have two types of suits, but 5 suits in total. No, I think it's 7 suits in total. And you are trying to collect cards. The idea is that the theme of the game is that you are monks who are duplicating sacred scripts. And so one set of suits is illustrators and one is scribes, actually people who would write the lettering. The other part are materials that you need to do this. Those are the suits, and you're collecting all of those. And then at the same time, you have another suit that's basically allows you to change the dice. They don't count towards scoring at all. First, you're bidding on, it's played in 2 rounds. First, you bid on which card you want to buy. We'll get to auction games later in a later episode. But then you're going to, in the end, what you're trying to do is collect these suits. You're trying to get the most cards of the most value of these suits. And what makes things a little bit more interesting is you're also manipulating these dice to make some suits more valuable than the others. Obviously trying to manipulate it so you get the highest score. It's a relatively short game, about half an hour. I find it really interesting because of the fact that you can manipulate the value of the relative value of the suits. And that's the fascinating part. But that at the core, it's a set collection game with some manipulation on the value of sets.
Yeah, I'm really bad at that game. I don't think
I'm
I've ever
awful.
come close to winning. But
I'm
it's fun.
well, somebody had to win, and all 3 of us are awful, so something's going on there. But maybe our wives always win.
The 4th person in the game always wins with us, no matter who it is. I think the last set building game I want to bring up, because it's a little different from all of these, is Sheriff of Nottingham. So Sheriff of Nottingham, you're a merchant and you're bringing goods into Nottingham, and you can pick apples, chicken, bread, whatever you want to bring in. The set collection part comes in that at the end of the game, whoever has the most of a certain type gets bonus points.
Okay.
So you strategically choose what sets you want to bring in so that you can collect more points at the end of the game, because if you bring the most apples in, you're going to get whatever the apple king bonus is,
Okay.
the gold bonus. So it really, it's a little different from these games, right? Because it's a bluffing game. It's very much based on the social interaction of the game. But the second collection kind of sneaks in as a secondary mechanic in that game, which can actually decide the winner and loser of the game, as far as I've played.
That one's really interesting to me because that's the one game in my set that you've played more than I have. In fact, I've never played it. This is my collection. I've never played it.
Yeah, I don't know.
So you said that, and I was like, I did not realize at all that set collection was part of that game. So
you learn something new every day,
even about my own collection. So I guess the last thing really is you have, maybe it's not the last thing, but you have cards just that represent other things, right? So I'm thinking of Catan, where cards represent resources in the game. They're not really played as cards. It's just, it needs to be hidden information. You don't want people to know what resources you have. I mean, they could track it in their brain if they really wanted to, but that would take a lot of effort.
In Catan, not in other games.
Not always in other games, but in that one, people get to see what you take into your hand, but they don't get to see your hand per se.
And none of us can ever remember what everybody else has.
I'm not that good. So
it's essentially hidden
it's
information.
essentially hidden information, yes. So, but they're not, you're not playing for suits, you're not playing combos. They just are resources that you're then going to turn in to buy other things, essentially. And there's a number of games that play that way.
Well, and it's become a semi-popular trend now to make games of other games that are only based on cards. So they're more modular or whatever. Castles and Burgundy did it. One of our favorites is San Juan, is really a reimplementation of Puerto Rico that only uses cards.
Right.
With the rules slightly different, but also able to move around a lot easier.
Yeah.
Not as many components.
And in that one, the cards are not only resources, but they're also victory points, and
they represent everything.
They represent buildings that you've built. And so it's a multi-use card, which is a little hard the first time you go into it. Even as experienced as I was at games, the first time I played that game, it was a little hard for me to wrap my head around. This way it's this, face down it's money, face up it's what I built. It was just a little different for me.
Yeah, and I think that introduces a really interesting aspect into gaming too, of when the means in which you gain victory points and interact with the game and other players is also your currency within the game. So you have to kind of do cost benefit analysis of like, I really want to build this building, this coffee roasters, but I also want to build this other one, and I got to spend my coffee roasters as money face down rather than building it for the building that it is. So I think it's interesting that sometimes you got to use cards as money that otherwise you may have want to build as buildings.
Right.
So it definitely introduces some complication into the game.
Yeah, the complexity of that decision is what makes that game fun. Is how do I use this card? I could tuck it under a church and make it a victory point. I could build it as a building for future benefit, or I could just use it as money right now. And how do I do that the best way?
Yeah, and I think in San Juan, one of the biggest struggles I've had is when I kind of overspend on things or try to get the big building rather than just kind of ramp up, and then I end up with no cards in my hand.
Right.
Because then you literally can't do anything because you can't build buildings.
Right.
You can't buy anything. So you're just kind of stuck until you can draw more cards.
Right.
So you're also balancing the money you want to spend, the victory points you want to get, the buildings you want to build with not completely emptying your hand, because then you're kind of stuck for a round or two not being able to do anything.
So I've just built the Silversmithy, one of the most expensive production buildings in the game. I have no cards to do anything else with for the next 2 turns because I did that. So was that really the smartest move?
Maybe.
It kind of depends on the way the rest of the game's going, but
usually for me, no, it was not the smartest move.
I think the last thing we haven't really talked about, and I don't think it usually comes up in scoring the game like a lot of the other mechanisms we have talked about, but it's drafting, which is usually in the front end or building the game. I know we've played a couple different games with the drafting mechanism, where by some means there's either a common pool or a turn-based pool that you get to choose a couple cards to put in your hand, is really what it boils down to. And a lot of times I feel like those are at the start of the game rather than throughout the game.
I don't know what you mean by that.
So, for example, we played Campaign Manager 2008, I think it was.
Oh, right.
Where the whole first half of the game was you're drafting your deck, and then the second half of the game was then using that deck to play the game.
Yeah, it was almost the setup.
Right.
Right? So Star Trek Fleet Captains is the same way, right? There are 10 different decks. Some emphasize combat, some emphasize diplomacy or science, and you get to pick 4 of those 10 decks to construct a deck up front. And that's actually considered a form of drafting. Some people call it deck building. Kind of crosses that line. There are times when deck building and drafting kind of merge a little bit. There's some overlap there. That is definitely one form of drafting. You're ready to say something?
I was just going to say, I think in my mind, the difference between drafting and deck building is that in drafting, you're constructing your hand or cards on the table, whereas in deck building, you're really constructing a deck that lets you interact with the game and with the other players. So, for example, in not Seven Wonders, in Ticket to Ride, right, you're drafting off out of a common pool of train cards, and you're not building up a deck of cards, right? You're just building in your hand to spend later. And then again, in Seven Wonders, you're not building a deck of cards to play with, but you're drafting from your hand to build on your civilization that's on the board.
And then you pass the hand. That's the interesting part.
So I think they're very similar. I think for me, the difference is drafting, you're building a hand to spend or to place out on the board. In deck building, you're kind of building a deck to use in the game ongoing.
I never thought of it that way, but that really does make sense to me.
But you can use drafting to build your deck. To build
Yeah,
a deck.
absolutely.
Wow, now you just blew the whole thing away. Now I gotta unwind my head and rewrap it.
And I think a lot of games that use drafting have similarities with set collection and set collection with drafting. There are some that they're not the same. I think a lot of the games that we tend to play intermix them.
Yeah.
Man, how many times can I talk about Sushi Go in one episode?
Well,
Sushi Go, Seven Wonders, Ticket to Ride, all these kinds of things include some elements of
set collection
along with drafting.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
So there are tons of games out there that use cards and card mechanics, from party games to complicated board games that are using cards as resource representation, drafting, set collection, deck building, all these different kinds of games that use cards. So we hope that as you sit down and you're playing board games with your family and friends, you can kind of keep your eye out for kind of what mechanics you're using with these cards and what these cards are representing. Because I think as we come to understand the games we play more, the more we get to enjoy them, the more we fall in love with the hobby. So get out there, play games, and enjoy card mechanics.
This has been the Analog Gamers Podcast. Thanks for listening. Please spread the word about our podcast, which can be found at theanaloggamers.libsyn.com. You can email us at theanaloggamers@gmail.com or find us on Facebook as The Analog Gamers. Our intro and outro are recorded by Daniel Feldman. Logo artwork provided by Tabitha Jordan Nichols. The Analog Gamers Podcast is licensed under Attribution, No Commercial, Non-Derivative, Creative Commons 4.0 license.